Yeah. All right, everyone. Welcome to our first speaker event of the semester. My name is Rob Metcalf in the philosophy department here, and it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Mark Tanzer, here at UCD. Professor Tanzer has been here forever. He since 1990, and in his time here at UCD, he has been an award-winning teacher. He had the good sense to hire the rest of us in the and his area of specialization in research is Martin Heidegger's philosophy. He's published a book on Heidegger, numerous articles. He is the co-translator of Heidegger's basic concepts of Aristotelian philosophy, which is an amazing. I can't even find words to express how great this translation is.
Please buy it.
In any case, today he is talking to us about Heidegger and animality. So please join me in welcoming Mark Tanzer.
Thank you, Rob, and thanks everyone for coming. The handout is a little incomprehensible, but as we're going through it, I'll be pointing out sort of what the point of it is, just to keep some of these different terms straight. So I'll get right to it. One of the more striking features of Heidegger's references to animals is their apparently patent anthropocentrism. Typically, he compares animals and humans in order to elucidate the human being's ontological structure. And in these comparisons, the animal is characterized as lacking some constitutive aspect of the human's way of being. For the animal, to be Dasein is to lack Dasein. And by the way, the term Dasein just refers to the ontological structure of the human being for Heidegger. So I'll be using the terms human and Dasein not quite interchangeably, but if you think of it that way, it shouldn't cause problems. So again, in his comparisons between the animal and the human, the animal is characterized as lacking some constitutive aspect of the human's way of being. For the animal, to not be Dasein is to lack Dasein. And not surprisingly, Heidegger has been regularly criticized for maintaining this anthropocentric view of animals. Heidegger's most extensive analysis of the nature of animals, found in the 1929 and 1930 lecture course entitled The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, seems to be a clear example of his anthropocentrism. There, Heidegger approaches animality by way of a division between three types of entities: human beings, animals, and mere objects. His analysis distinguishes these types of entities with regard to their differing ways of being related to the world. Specifically, the object is worldless, the animal is poor in world, and the human being is world-forming. That's the first part of the handout there. You've just got the hierarchy there, which he's going to say isn't a hierarchy. That's my question. Heidegger's three-part division appears anthropocentric insofar as the world relations characteristic of the mere object and of the animal are both characterized as kinds of deficiencies in comparison with the human being's characteristic world relation. For the human being as world-forming has a world, while the object and the animal as worldless and poor in world respectively have no world, albeit in different ways. The worldlessness of the object and the world poverty of the animal, then, are two distinct ways of not having a world, ways of lacking what the world-forming human being has, or in other words, ways of lacking Dasein. So for Heidegger, to be an animal is to be structured by a kind of negativity, that is, by the specific mode of negation that he refers to as world poverty, which is a lack of Dasein. Although the view of animality that's articulated here appears to be clearly anthropocentric, Heidegger suggests that the issue is not as clear as it seems. He takes up this issue at the beginning of his analysis of animality, and again at the end of that analysis. In the former discussion, at the beginning of the analysis, Heidegger resists the charge of anthropocentrism when he maintains that his conception of the animal as poor in world, quote, must not be taken as a hierarchical evaluation. Heidegger's second discussion of anthropocentrism, which is at the end of this long analysis, begins by admitting that his own attempt to avoid such a hierarchy has failed due to the comparative nature of the analysis. As comparatively determined, his characterization of the animal as poor in world is, quote, not drawn from animality itself, close quote. Therefore, quote, it's only from the human perspective that the animal is poor with respect to world, close quote. Nevertheless, Heidegger concludes this self-criticism, and with it the entire analysis of animality on a less critical and more apparatic note. He maintains that until we arrive at a fuller understanding of the nature of world, because it's in terms of world relations that these distinctions are made, he says, until we get a fuller understanding of the nature of world, we can't pass judgment on the ultimate legitimacy of his conception of the animal. The legitimacy being whether it's simply derived from the human, or if it is a characterization of animality that is derived from the nature of the animal itself. Only then can it be determined whether there is, quote, poverty in the animal's specific manner of being as such, close quote, or if such poverty obtains only in comparison to Dasein. With this in mind, Heidegger concludes the analysis by maintaining that, quote, the thesis that the animal is poor in world must remain as a problem. So this is a sort of typical Heideggerian yes, no, maybe. Thanks for nothing. In view of the above, it seems that the question concerning Heidegger's anthropocentrism can only be resolved by way of a detour through his conception of world, a detour that would effectively lead us through the entirety of Heidegger's works. We're not going to do that. However, the self-criticism found in the 1929-1930 lecture course offers another path toward the solution of this problem. Specifically, if the type of deficiency that's definitive of animality is shown to be an intrinsically determined deficiency, and not only a comparatively determined deficiency, that is, not only a deficiency in comparison with Dasein, then the characterization of the animal as poor in world would be drawn from animality itself, rather than obtaining only from the human perspective. In this way, Heidegger's characterization of the animal as deficient could be defended against the charge of anthropocentrism, since, according to Heidegger, it's precisely the apparently comparative nature of the animal's definitive deficiency that renders his characterization open to such a charge. In order to determine if the animal is intrinsically deficient or merely comparatively deficient, we must take a closer look at the mode of negativity that's characteristic of the animal, that is, poverty. And by the way, so after that little hierarchy at the top of the handout you have there, the basic question that the paper will be asking, whether poverty, more specifically in the case of the animal, world poverty, is intrinsic or comparative. Heidegger's initial adumbration of the animal's world poverty distinguishes poverty from two other types of negation, quantitative lack and absolute lack. And the next two bits of the handout there are these comparisons. We will proceed by examining Heidegger's way of contrasting poverty with these other types of negation, beginning with his distinction between poverty and absolute lack. Absolute lack is the type of negativity that characterizes the mere object's worldlessness. So their worldlessness is a kind of absolute lack. That's on the handout. And according to Heidegger, an object such as a stone is worldless insofar as the entities among which it is found are, quote, essentially inaccessible to the stone itself. That is, a stone's lack of access to the beings around it is not simply a contingent fact about that stone, but is due to its very way of being, what he calls its presence at hand. So that's why he said that the stone is, that other objects are essentially inaccessible to the stone because it's a matter of its ontology, of its way of being. So the object's worldlessness, its absolute lack of access to other entities, is determined by its ontological structure. Its absolute lack is in this sense an ontological lack. And we could see why such an ontological lack is necessarily absolute by examining Heidegger's claim that the object's worldlessness, its ontological lack of access to other entities, is different than the animal's world poverty, insofar as the latter is a deprivation of world, whereas worldlessness is not. So this is the distinction I'm drawing there at the, in the handout, between worldlessness as absolute lack and world poverty as a deprivation. It's in terms of this idea of a deprivation that he makes the distinction. Worldlessness is not a deprivation, since the being that suffers from an ontologically determined lack is not, properly speaking, deprived of that which it lacks, as what it lacks does not even pertain to it in any way. The ontological structure of the being that has an ontological lack renders that being completely unrelated to what it lacks. Deprivation, on the other hand, is, quote, and here this is, in the handout, deprivation, you've got the definition of it right there, which is, quote, a lacking or absence of something which could be present and generally ought to be present. So we'll see this is going to be the definition of deprivation, and therefore the main way of characterizing world poverty. Thus, a mere object, and this is why the difference between absolute lack and deprivation in the case of the object would be as follows. A mere object is not deprived of access to other objects, any more than it's deprived of, say, the ability to read, since both having access to other objects and being able to read are such that they neither could be nor ought to be possessed by a mere object, as they conflict with its way of being. That's why we don't call rocks illiterate. As determined by an entity's ontological structure, then, to lack something ontologically is to be completely unrelated to it, rendering that lack in principle irremediable. Therefore, an ontological lack is absolute insofar as remediation of an ontological lack is an absolute impossibility. However, the same considerations that militate against an ontological lack being a deprivation also imply that such a lack is, properly speaking, not even a lack at all. And here, he doesn't talk about this in this particular lecture course, but in Being and Time, he makes a similar argument where he's distinguishing human being or Dasein from objects, and what he says there is, whereas Dasein, or the human being, is concerned with its world, or it has interests, he says, an object like a stone is completely disinterested in its world. But then he says, actually, it's really saying too much to say it's disinterested, because it's not as though the rock is failing to engage with its world. He says, in fact, it's neither interested nor disinterested, because having interest has nothing to do with it. It's a category mistake to call it disinterested. It's like saying the chair is illiterate or so the point being, an absolute lack, in the sense of an ontological lack, is really not a lack. It's not as though the rock is missing something. By the same token, since the stone's inability to access objects, and here analogous to this idea of being interested is the whole question of stones having access to objects. Since the stone's inability to access objects is determined by its ontological structure, the stone is not, properly speaking, without such access. It doesn't really lack access to objects any more than it lacks the ability to read. Rather, just as the stone's presence at hand, its way of being, renders it neither interested nor disinterested, this way of being also renders it neither with nor without access to objects. Having such access does not pertain to the object any more than having interest does. The object's worldlessness, then, being an ontological lack, is not a lack at all. So that's what's intended to be captured in that first part of the handout, that first distinction. except this last part now, and now we'll see why why worldlessness then is a merely comparative deficiency, whereas world poverty wants it to turn out that that's not merely comparative. So, question then is, why then does Heidegger characterize worldlessness as a lack, if, as we just seen, it really isn't, or as a, quote, kind of not having a world? Here we must keep in mind that the analysis under consideration is comparative, insofar as the worldlessness of the mere object and the world poverty of the animal are explicated in comparison with the human being's world-forming character. Refer to the top of the handout. And from this point of view, worldlessness can be seen as a lack, as when we compare it with human. Notice that, notice that Heidegger's characterization of the stone is blatantly anthropocentric, or in other words, not drawn in this case from presence at hand itself, since it's only from the human perspective, to use his words against him, that the present at hand object lacks a world. Thus, the type of deficiency that's definitive of presence at hand, that is, absolute lack, is not an intrinsically determined deficiency, but only a comparatively determined deficiency, a deficiency in comparison with Dasein. The anthropocentrism of Heidegger's characterization of objects here certainly supports the claim that his view of animals is also anthropocentric, for in both cases the world relations definitive of these non-human types of beings are determined to be deficient through the same comparison with Dasein's world relation. And presumably, such a comparative analysis ineluctably leads to an anthropocentric position, as its results only obtained from the human perspective. In order to see if this criticism does in fact apply not only to Heidegger's explication of the way of being of the object, but also to his explication of animality, we look to the second type of negativity from which Heidegger distinguishes poverty, that is quantitative lack. And here comes the next division, the next contrast on the handout. Heidegger explicates the distinction between poverty and quantitative lack by showing that the latter, like absolute lack, is not a deprivation. He illustrates this with the example of, quote, the poor or meager flow of water in a stream. To understand why quantitative lack is not a deprivation, recall that poverty for Heidegger is a type of deprivation since it's a lack of something that could be present and generally ought to be present. As a deprivation is a lack that not only could be remedied, but also should be remedied. That which suffers from a deprivation is such that remediation of that deficiency is not only possible for it, but is required of it. Its very nature demands remediation of the lack. For the possession of that which it lacks is constitutive of its ontological structure. That's in the case of deprivation. In this way, that which is deprived is intrinsically and not merely comparatively in a state of deficiency. By contrast, a quantitative lack is a deficiency that could be remedied, although there's no reason that it should be. What I'm going to say now is going to be a little sketchy. I'll back up after I read this and explain it. That is, a thing that suffers from a quantitative lack is in a deficient state only in relation to a previous or subsequent state of that thing, or another thing of the same type. Its bearing a quantitative lack is not intrinsically, but only comparatively a deficiency. And so the possession of what it lacks is not constitutive of its ontological structure. And as thus comparative, it's not a lack that should be remedied. The nature of the thing does not demand remediation of that lack. To clarify that a little, I know I kind of didn't understand it when I was writing. The idea is this. With his example of poor or meager water flow in a stream, that could be either a deficiency or a quantitative lack, depending, and here's what it depends on. If the water flow is so meager that the stream stops functioning as a stream or being a stream, whatever exactly that would amount to, then the ontological structure of the stream would demand remediation. Whereas if the deficiency in water flow doesn't affect its being a stream, then the ontological structure of the stream doesn't demand that the water flow be increased, because it's not losing its streamness in any way. And that's what Heidegger means when he says that it's only comparative. If it's a quantitative lack, it's only a lack in comparison with other states that the stream has or could be in, or that a stream has or could be in. That is, amounts of water flow that are more than its currently not fairly meager water flow. So a quantitative lack then doesn't demand, or it's not a lack that ought to be remedied. As in the case of the stream that's got a little bit less water flow, but it's not ruining its streamness. Whereas if it's so low that it's stopping to be a stream, then the ontological structure of the stream demands remediation. And that would be not merely a quantitative lack, but a deprivation. Okay. Up to this point in our analysis, here's what's happened up to this point. We followed Heidegger's initial approach to the animal's world poverty, which proceeds by distinguishing poverty from quantitative lack and from absolute lack. And we found that in both cases, poverty is distinguished by its being a type of deprivation, which is a type of lack that both could be remedied and ought to be remedied. Again, that's the basic definition. An absolute lack, on the other hand, is not a deprivation, since it neither could be remedied nor ought to be remedied, while a merely quantitative lack could be remedied, although it's not the case that it ought to be. By drawing these distinctions in this way, Heidegger highlights the basic factor that's peculiar to poverty as a specific mode of negation. So I think this is the point of these comparisons. And what's definitive of poverty is that it's a deficiency that ought to be remedied. That is, a deficiency whose remediation is demanded by the ontological structure of that which is in the state of poverty. Furthermore, we've seen that insofar as remediation of a state of poverty is so demanded, poverty is an intrinsic lack, whereas absolute lack and quantitative lack are merely comparative, since remediation of such deficiencies is not so demanded. So that's tracing out then these two distinctions. And again, the point is, I mean, if you think of it sort of like a chart, poverty being a deprivation both can and ought to be remedied. Absolute lack can't. So you'd figure there's no reason to say it ought to be. It couldn't possibly be, although we'll see Heidegger's going to go against that. Quantitative lack could be, but there's no reason why it ought to be. So these are the basic distinctions. In view of the above, we can see why Heidegger initially resisted the anthropocentric interpretation of his notion of the animal as poor in world. Poverty is an intrinsically determined deficiency, and so Heidegger's characterization of the animal as poor in world is drawn from animality itself, rather than obtaining only from the human perspective. So this is why at the beginning of the analysis he says, I'm not doing hierarchy, that this is an intrinsic deficiency. But if the intrinsically determined nature of poverty precludes an anthropocentric interpretation of the animal's world poverty, then why does Heidegger rescind his assertion of the non-anthropocentric character of his analysis thereof? He does this at the end of the analysis. In order to answer this question, we must take a closer look at world poverty, focusing on what exactly it is that's lacked by that which is poor in world. And according to Heidegger, the animal lacks a world insofar as it fails to apprehend beings as beings. This is something I won't go into too much, but we can talk about this later. That is, although the animal's not worldless, but rather has access to beings, and that's how it's different than the stone. It doesn't recognize them as such. So the animal's world poverty, the deficiency that is definitive of animality, is its failure to apprehend beings as such, its lack of the as. And as far as what that amounts to, we could talk about later when he gets into specific descriptions of what he says an animal's experience is like when it doesn't have the as structure. And given Heidegger's characterization of poverty as a deprivation, that is as an intrinsic deficiency, the animal's world poverty must be a lack whose remediation is demanded by the ontological structure of the animal. So you think that the ontological structure of the animal would demand that it apprehend beings as such. However, that's precisely what he doesn't say. Or at least at first, Heidegger's analysis of the animal's lack of the as suggests that there is no such demand. So why would he call it a deficiency? For he maintains that the, quote, apprehending of something as something, close quote, is impossible for the animal. Furthermore, he sees this impossibility as obtaining by virtue of the animal's ontological structure. But if, as Heidegger claims, the animal's lack of the as is irremediable due to its very way of being, then this would seem to imply that the animal's lack of world is not a form of poverty after all. For as we've seen, such irremediability is characteristic of absolute lack, which, unlike poverty, is not a type of deprivation. And that is just as the mere object is not deprived of access to beings, since such access doesn't even pertain to it, insofar as its worldlessness is an ontologically determined deficiency, so the animal is apparently not deprived of the ability to apprehend beings as beings, since such apprehension does not even pertain to it, insofar as its failure to do so is ontologically determined. If this is the case, however, then the animal's lack of the as is merely comparative for the same reasons that the object's lack of access to beings is comparative. That is, since the as does not even pertain to the animal, this lack of world is not, properly speaking, a lack at all, although it can be seen as such from the human perspective. So now it looks like the lack of the as is like, to say the animal lacks the as is like saying the chair's illiterate. Therefore, Heidegger's characterization of the animal as not having a world repeats the blatant anthropocentrism found in his characterization of the mere object's way of not having a world. The comparative nature of Heidegger's analogous again leads ineluctably to an anthropocentric position, and so at the end of the analysis he rescinds his assertion of the non-anthropocentric character of that analysis. But of course he's going to then go back on that. Why then does Heidegger almost immediately, and by almost I mean like 2 sentences, why does Heidegger almost immediately temper the above rescinder with the lecture course's final word on the problem of animality, that the characterization of the animal as poor in world, quote, must remain as a problem? Why this indecision as to whether the animal's lack of world is in fact a form of poverty or an absolute lack? To make sense of Heidegger's indecision regarding his own anthropocentrism, we begin by recalling that, for Heidegger, a deprivation is a lack of something that could be present and ought to be present. That is, it not only could be remedied, but it also should be. And the animal's lack of the as appears not to be a deprivation, insofar as it's a deficiency that cannot be remedied. So it looks like it's not, if it's, for it to be a deprivation, it's got to be something that could be and ought to be remedied, but it can't, so you'd think it must not be a deprivation. I mean, otherwise you'd have to have an ought without a can. That's what is going to happen. Recall, in addition, that Heidegger's attempt to articulate a non-anthropocentric conception of animality conceives of the animal's definitive deficiency as intrinsically rather than merely comparatively determined. This, as we've seen, is why his manner of distinguishing poverty from absolute lack and from quantitative lack highlighted the fact that poverty is a deficiency that ought to be remedied. as the basic characteristic peculiar to poverty as a specific mode of negation. With these considerations in mind, Heidegger could only hold that the animal's lack of the as is a case of poverty, that is, he could only say it's a case of deprivation, by maintaining something you'd think nobody could maintain. That is, that this deficiency ought to be remedied, despite the fact that it can't be remedied. The animal's ontological structure would have to both demand and preclude remediation of its failure to apprehend beings as such. That this in fact is Heidegger's position can be seen by noting his characterization of world poverty as a withholding, that's at the bottom. According to Heidegger, quote, the possibility of apprehending something as something, say apprehending something as something, is withheld from the animal or taken away from the animal. That is, as withheld, the animal's lack of the as is a lack of something that's taken away from it, and so is a lack of something that belongs to the animal. And this is due to its very way of being. Remediation of the animal's lack of the as, then, is demanded by virtue of its ontological structure. It's an intrinsic lack, a deficiency that ought to be remedied. Yet, the animal could never possess the as, and this impossibility, too, is due to the animal's way of being. Remediation of the animal's lack of the as, then, is as much precluded as it is demanded by virtue of the animal's ontological structure. Therefore, as a withholding, the animal's failure to apprehend beings as beings is an intrinsic deficiency that ought to be remedied, although it can't. This is how the animal's lack of the as can be a deprivation. It's the only one. Can be a deprivation, although its ontological structure precludes it from possessing the as. Now, given Heidegger's notion of a withholding and of world poverty as a deprivation of this specific type, we must ask again about his indecision regarding his own anthropocentrism, as whether this is an intrinsically determined way. Since the animal's lack of world is a withholding of the as rather than an absolute lack thereof, Heidegger seems to be absolved of the charge of having drawn his characterization of the animal only from the human perspective. So why does his explication of world poverty as a withholding, which is an intrinsic deficiency, leave him unsatisfied? This dissatisfaction is intensified. The question, why is he saying, well, it's a problem? It seems like it just stopped being a problem. This dissatisfaction is intensified when Heidegger offers another somewhat cryptic, highly cryptic, consideration regarding his conception of animality. Here's the quote. He says, quote, if deprivation in certain forms is a kind of suffering, and poverty and deprivation of world belong to the animal's being, then a kind of pain and suffering would have to permeate the whole animal realm and the realm of life in general, close quote. Before addressing these remarks, let us first consider a more obvious reason that could account for Heidegger's suspicion of his own analysis. That is the sheer coherence of his conception of world poverty as a withholding. That is the sheer coherence of the idea of an ought without a can. An ought without a can. At first glance, and then we'll get back to this whole weird thing he says about suffering, kind of out of nowhere. At first glance, the coherence of Heidegger's notion of world poverty seems questionable, insofar as it maintains that the animal is beset with a demand that is, in principle, beyond any possible resolution, and ought without a can. How could remediation of the animal's lack of the as be required if such remediation is impossible, particularly when both the requirement and the impossibility are ontologically determined? Is a being with such an ontological structure nothing more than a blatant self-contradiction? Still, Heidegger does not seem to take the apparently self-contradictory nature of world poverty as cause for concern. He's not concerned about that sort of thing ever. And this should not be surprising, since a similar internal tension is found in the ontological structure of Dasein, as you get the same sort of apparent self-contradiction in the Dasein structure, most clearly in Being and Time's characterization of Dasein as ontologically guilty. As in the case of the animal's world poverty, Dasein's ontological guilt saddles it with a demand that is in principle beyond any possible resolution, a demand whose resolution is withheld and ought without a can. Isn't put it in those terms there, but it's the same thing. And basically the idea is that in Being and Time, Dasein is driven by virtue of its ontological structure to achieve itself in the sense of, and here speaking kind of loosely, to achieve a kind of self-sufficiency through an achievement of the understanding of being. Dasein's ontological guilt, most clearly in what he calls in Being and Time its thrownness, refers to the fact that precisely what Dasein is driven toward by virtue of its ontological structure, and what would count as Dasein being itself, is also by its ontological structure. It is also by its ontological structure precluded from ever getting to that. So as in the same way that he's describing the way of being of the animal, as a kind of ought without a can, an ontologically determined demand that's also ontologically determined to be impossible, are combined in the Dasein structure, just as they are here. So this is why he doesn't find this thing to be as that to be a reason to say the analysis has just blown up in my face, I better start over again. This is what he does. Given that for Heidegger, both Dasein's guilt and the animal's world poverty are cases of withholding, we can save his conception of animality from being reduced to a blatant self-contradiction by ascertaining how he saves Dasein from such a reduction in Being and Time. The way he does this in Being and Time is by characterizing Dasein's negativity as a type of potentiality. So there's this idea of a withholding. We can make sense of it by thinking of it in terms of a type of potentiality. He says that Dasein is, quote, being possible, or, quote, potentiality for being. In short, the idea is that as potentiality for being, Dasein is an unactualizable possibility. A possibility, and sometimes he doesn't use this terminology, but you can think of it as sort of a pure possibility, and that's a way of sort of cashing out this idea of a withholding or an ought without a can. That is, Dasein is an unactualizable possibility, a possibility that must always remain a possibility, never an actuality. Its ontological guilt, its negativity, thought in terms of potentiality, is its inability to overcome its being possible, and thereby be itself actually. In the fundamental concept of metaphysics, Heidegger addresses the apparent self-contradiction inherent in his conception of world poverty in the same way. He conceives it as a possibility that must always remain a possibility. Specifically, he describes poverty as, quote, not having in being able to have. That is, as a not having, poverty is a type of lack, and as a lack in being able to have, it's a lack in the mode of being able to have, in the mode of potentiality. One of the things that Heidegger does throughout his work is distinguishes all different kinds of negations and negativities, and here we find one of, again, we've seen a bunch of them already, but here's a type of negativity that he articulates, is the idea of negation in the mode of potentiality, specifically in the mode of an unactualizable potentiality. Now, whether or not the notion of an unactualizable potentiality, and in principle unactualizable, because you might think, well, that's not a possibility, that's an impossibility, but whether this notion of an unactualizable potentiality is ultimately any more coherent than that of an ought without a can, Heidegger's invocation of the former, unactualizable potentiality, in his characterization of world poverty, suggests that his indecision regarding the anthropocentrism of his own conception of animality does not issue from a concern about the sheer coherence of the idea of world poverty. So even though we might find it incoherent, but he doesn't, and that's not what's bothering him. Apparently he sees the negativity that lies at the heart of animality to be no more incoherent than that which lies at the heart of Dasein. This then must not be the source of Heidegger's indecision. And so we're left with Heidegger's previously cited remarks concerning deprivation and suffering as the apparent source of his misgivings. There, Heidegger maintains that characterizing the animal as poor in and thus deprived of world implies that, again, quote, a kind of pain and suffering would have to permeate the whole animal realm, insofar as, again, quoting, deprivation in certain forms is a kind of suffering. Heidegger's hesitant to unequivocally endorse his non-anthropocentric characterization of the animal as deprived, then, because this would imply that pain and suffering are constitutive of the animal's ontological structure, and so, quote, permeate the whole animal realm. But why did Heidegger find this implication to be not only problematic, the implication that if the animal's deprived, then it is shot through with pain and suffering? Why did Heidegger find this implication to be not only problematic, but so problematic that it jeopardizes the entire analysis of animality, and with it Heidegger's attempt to avoid anthropocentrism? It's also, I think, something to notice here is that this would also imply then, given that Dasein and being in time also has this same withholding structure, that would imply pain and suffering in the human realm, but he doesn't seem to find that to be problematic. And one of the things he also says immediately there, he says this would imply pain and that a kind of suffering would permeate the whole animal realm. And then he says, but biology doesn't say anything about that, which for Heidegger is a really strange thing to say, to refer to science.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that little passage, there's all sorts of weird things that seem to be occurring there. Without an explicit answer from Heidegger, we can only conjecture as to his reasons. To follow one such line of conjecture, recall that throughout his work, Heidegger's references to animals typically characterize them as deficient in relation to human beings. And in so characterizing them, he repeatedly makes a point of maintaining an ontological abyss between Dasein and animals, and he even uses that word. In this regard, the 1929-1930 lecture course is no exception. Could Heidegger's misgivings about the analysis of animality carried out there be born of an uneasiness with the extent to which his characterization of the animal as poor in world maintains that abyss? This may be the source of Heidegger's misgivings, since Dasein and the animal share a definitive similarity insofar as both are irremediably potential, driven by that which is withheld, intrinsically deficient, structured by a negativity. On the one hand, this structural similarity, shared by the human being and the animal, doesn't identify them, as what's intrinsically lacked in each case is different. That is, where Dasein can never overcome its thrownness or its guilt, the animal can never overcome its failure to apprehend beings as beings. Still, this difference, that is the difference between thrownness and world poverty, may fall somewhat short of an abyss. For Dasein, here's why. For Dasein's thrownness, or its guilt, renders it powerless in the face of beings, and thus capable of being affected thereby, or as Heidegger sometimes says, submitted to its world. Since this submission makes Dasein's affectivity possible, it makes it possible for Dasein to suffer. In Dasein's thrownness, then, lies the possibility of suffering. It's precisely as thrown that Dasein suffers. And Heidegger claims to characterize the animal as poor in world, as deprived, carries the same implication. implication. According to Heidegger, if the animal were essentially poverty-stricken, then it too would suffer. In fact, it would be permeated by pain and suffering. Heidegger's suspicion of this conception of animality, then, could well be grounded in his attempt to reserve the realm of suffering, of finitude for the human being. It may be that Heidegger recoils in the face of the closing of the abyss between the animal and the human. Maybe for Heidegger, the closing of this purported abyss is too high a price to pay for his attempt to move beyond anthropocentrism.
We do have time for question and answer.
Yes.
How do we know that animals don't recognize beings?
Yeah, it's a long story. And this, so I mean, this is a problem. Well,
He didn't know.
yeah, I mean, it's like, well, what evidence is there for this conception of animals to begin with? And this is why, first of all, like I was saying before, referring to science is a strange thing for Heidegger to do. And actually, in this analysis, he does a long analysis of some studies of bees and, but mostly about bees and experiments that allegedly show that they don't experience things as things. And what he says is that, in fact, the way they, before I answer, the way that, I'm going to just talk and not answer that. He says that the way that they experience the world without the as is a kind, he calls it a kind of captivation by objects. That they're sort of so absorbed in objects that they can't sort of step back and recognize them as such, that it's this complete absorption. And the question would be, well, how do you know that, right? What kind of evidence? And that's, I mean, the short answer is that for him it is phenomenological. What he says is, I mean, as a phenomenologist, and this, what he writes this in his period where he's still primarily a phenomenologist, the idea is that that's just the way we experience them. That's our immediate uninterpreted everyday experience of animals is as being absorbed in their world in this way and as lacking the as. Now, the problem with phenomenology, of course, is it depends on your having, I mean, you say, well, I've got to describe immediate experience first and then derive an ontology from that, and the whole question, the problem is, well, is that really a good description? Because you could say, well, this is how I experience animals, and I would say, well, I don't, I experience them as like, objects or something. So that's part of the problem for the phenomenological method, is always getting the right description up front. And a little more about that, the way that he talks about this sort of immediate experience of animals, he says that it's most clear in domestic animals, which is also kind of strange that he takes that as sort of the paradigmatic example of an animal, and that the paradigmatic example of our experience of animals is domestic animals, and it's even more specific, it's a dog.
Even more specific, a puppy.
Yeah, right. And what he says, he says, look, we and he does another one of these little hierarchies. It's actually the same threefold division. And he says, in the case of objects, so he says, how do I know how an animal experiences the world? And he says, well, I have to transpose myself into the animal and experience its experience. And you say, well, what? Right? That sounds impossible. But he says, look, here's how it works. He says, on the one hand, when it comes to mere objects, I experience them in such a way that I can't transpose myself into the object because there's nothing to get transposed into. So the chair doesn't have, or the rock doesn't have an experience, so I can't experience its experience. So that's an impossibility. Then he says, other side of the other pole of this hierarchy, in the case of other humans, he says, well, I know how other humans experience the world because I find myself, I don't have to try to transpose myself into other humans. That's my way of being, is to be with others. This is his whole thing. This is his way around the whole problem of intersubjectivity as being a pseudo problem to begin with. He says that in the case of other human beings, I exist with them, and so I find myself necessarily transposed into other human beings. Which not to say that I know what your precise experience is like. I know what it's like to be a human, right? My race, gender, class, and all that sort of thing. And I don't know what it's like to be someone of a different gender, different race. But I know what it's like to have a human experience per se. And so he says, whereas in the case of other objects, it's impossible to be transposed into them and to know what their experience is like because there's nothing there to get transposed into. How do I know that? That's my immediate experience of them. In the case of humans, it's not impossible, but it's necessary that I be transposed into them so I know what it's like to be another human, or I exist along with them. And again, his evidence for that, phenomenological. He says our immediate experience of the world is such that I'm sharing it with others and I exist with them. And then he says, but in the case of the animal, he says my immediate experience of them is such that I both am and am not transposed into them. Just like he's saying here, they both have and don't have a world. And he says it's precisely for that reason. He says, the way I experience animals is that they're not, I don't experience them as mere objects without an experience at all, but I also don't experience them as having the same sort of experience as myself. He says, and again he says, his example is the striking example of the domestic animal. He says, the dog is with us, but it really isn't. It lives with us. He says it's the domestic animal is part of the house, but not like the roof is part of the house. So it's with us, but not quite. He says we eat with it, but it doesn't really eat. It feeds, and we feed with it, but we don't really feed. We eat, and so it's a kind of. He says our experience of animals is such that we both exist along with them, like we do with other humans, but at the same time we also don't. And so, and what he ends up saying about that, so to answer your question, it's, the short answer is just phenomenological. He says that's how we experience them. And he says that the reason that we aren't simply transposed into them or can't know what it's like to be an animal in the same way that we know what it's like to be another human. It's like being a human, and I know what that's like. He says that in the case of the animal, the reason that I can't have its experience is because of this lack of the as, that it's got this kind of absorption. The other thing about that is what this all suggests, which I think is a way, something to follow out in all this, is it's a conception of which I think gets played out, and I think this is kind of evidence for the way that he's thinking of animals. It's an experience of animals as, on the one hand, and he'll say it this way, on the one hand, inviting our transposition into them, and at the same time precluding it. That there's both a kind of immediate kinship and at the same time an estrangement between humans and animals. Or another way to think of, there's a kind of attraction and a kind of repulsion that are simultaneous in our experience of animals, which I think could be a way to kind of make sense of the ways that we historically treat them, that they are, on the one hand, like us, and on the other hand, some sort of alien being, that we, I mean, something that anthrozoologists talk about a lot is the idea that we, on the one hand, we spoil some of them and spend all kinds of money on their doctor's bills, and then at the same time, animals that are just as smart, we torture them and eat them, right? And so I think with Heidegger, he says that we've got this immediate experience in which we're both one of them, and at the same time we're completely different. Anyway, so
Thanks.
and by the way, and so getting back to the idea how he knows this again, it's just he says this is, and so this is just how we experience them immediately, and I think the issue then would be to try to make the connection between this sort of attraction, repulsion, and how that is a result of specifically the lack of the as in the animal. And I think, just a little more going off on this tangent, that I think one of the ways to see that is the lack of the as he also sees as the lack of an understanding of being, which puts the animal in a position where it is completely submitted to its world. Because we're also submitted to the world. We can't just completely control it. We are affected by it. The world sort of impinges on us, and that's where pain and suffering come from, the stuff enthrownness. And I think his conception of the animal leads to, and I think this is what bothers him, ultimately is a conception of the animal as pure exposure to its world, and he'll use that terminology. He'll say that the animal is in this state of sort of pure exposure, and that's why he's saying that there would be this kind of suffering that would be intrinsic to animality. And so the way then he'll talk about the experience of objects that animals have is that rather than as sort of perceiving them or apprehending them, he'll talk about it as, besides this sort of being entranced by them, he'll also talk about it as being, he'll say that when they're affected by objects, rather than recognizing it as such, they're just sort of, he calls it an essential disruption that the animal undergoes. And I think he wants to reserve that kind of finitude and that kind of ability to suffer for humans, and I think that's why he finds this problematic. Yeah.
So is your analysis sort of historical? Because, I mean, forgive me, I haven't read enough Heidegger to know what I'm talking about, but it strikes me that his attitude toward animals has just been completely superseded by what we've learned in science, including the idea that anthropocentrism as a category to be excluded from analysis is correct either. In other words, we share a lot with animals with respect to some of their self-referential capabilities, at least in some animals. So in your opinion, is this interesting to watch this guy, call him Heidegger, wrestling with this problem? But, I mean, as Dewey might say, this is a problem that we've already gotten over. I think the analysis in terms of how to take a look at animals and our relationship to animals and anthropocentrism and what science says about animals has resisted this particular kind of categorization. But I don't know Heidegger, so I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
I mean, I think part of the problem is one of the things problematic about the analysis is even though he tries to avoid this, is that it does have a kind of hierarchization where the animal is just seen as deficient and as and it could and lacking a certain kind of consciousness, at least, right? That it's just sort of that's just sort of captivated by its world and can't step back and look at it. And I think he would say that, or I think that when you, let me back up, and that's what he gets criticized for a lot. He gets criticized a lot for this being anthropocentric, and there's a couple of different ways to take that. I mean, the way that I've been talking about and the way that he talks about it is whether it's sort of what I would call methodologically anthropocentric, whether the idea of the animal is just as a matter of method derived from the nature of the human being. Which would be different than whether or not, even if, I mean, which would be a different question as to whether or not it's anthropocentric in the sense of seeing animals as inferior, right? So,
Yeah.
on the one hand, and so, here's the thing. Here he's resisting the idea that the analysis as a matter of method is anthropocentric. But then whenever he typically talks about, regardless of the method, in a minute I'll say it's not so regardless though, that regardless of the method by which he comes up with this idea of animality, there's the problem of, is his conception of animality nevertheless, even if it's intrinsically derived like he wants it to be, is it nevertheless a picture that sees animals as just these sort of inferior beings? Right? And when he takes up that issue, usually the way that he phrases it, and this is what he gets criticized for, is he makes it sound like, yeah, they're just inferior. And he's here, it's sort of like what they're potentially us. It's, what they're missing is what we've got, the understanding of being. So it does look like, and even without, well, it does look like it's anthropocentric in the sense that regardless of how he gets at it methodologically, and he focuses on the methodological question, almost as though to have to avoid the other more important question is, are these inferior beings? And again, saying that they're just, on the one hand, saying that they're just absorbed in the world and they can't step back from it and think about it sounds like, well, that's an inferior kind of being. However, I think one of the reasons that this lecture course analysis is important is because I think that the conception, particularly when you look at his misgivings about his conception of animality, that it could be that you could reread what he says about animals to make it such that they don't turn out to be inferior, even given this analysis, and even given the fact that he always says they're just missing stuff we've got. He says they don't have hands, they have paws. Those aren't hands. Those are a completely different thing. They don't. He says they don't die. They just have a demise. They don't really die. They don't have an understanding of being. And again, they don't experience the world in any kind of reflective way. I think that when you look at this analysis and you look at the things he won't allow himself to see, that if you push it further, that it's arguable that something that he refused to say can be derived from Heidegger that could get him out of this sort of anthropocentric position. When you see the extent to which he seems to be protecting he seems to be protecting the human being from being too closely allied with animals in terms of this idea of the finitude and the ability to suffer. Now, as far as the whole question of, well, what about scientific advances and all that sort of thing, I think that Heidegger could still, despite any sort of empirical evidence, that he could still say, yeah, but there's no understanding of being happening there, and that they're not noticing the as, that it's more mechanical than it looks when we look at how animals behave. So how animals behave. So there's all this stuff about, well, can they be deceptive, and can they, doesn't that, or when you when they put the mark on the chimp's head while it's asleep, and then it looks in the mirror and it goes like this, right? That this seems to be saying, well, there's more going on than just sort of mechanical absorption in the world or something like that. I think what this sort of thing does is it allows him to sidestep the whole scientific debate.
Which is arguably not a good idea in this day and age.
Well, I mean, I think he would say that in any day and age that the phenomenological method would trump scientific advances. So I mean, Heidegger is not a big fan of science. And one of the things he says in this lecture course also, he said, is he's talking about these experiments with bees, where he's saying these show that it doesn't experience things as such, but is only absorbed. First of all, he's talking about a bee. And one of the things that he does also is lumps all animals together. Well, animals are animals, which is a whole other problem. But he does say, in the middle of that analysis, he says something to the effect of, well, we could dismiss this with the usual airs of philosophical superiority, but we really shouldn't do that. And then what he says is, actually all these experiments they don't prove his position, but they are compatible with his position. And so I think that the way that he does this is to, I mean, he addresses some of this scientific stuff, but ultimately it's not going to make from his point of view, it doesn't make or break the case. So the way I think of it is even if, suppose when my dog died, they cut his head open and found out there was just confetti in there. Now you could say, I'm just thinking about it, there wasn't much more, but you could say, well, there's your evidence that he wasn't thinking. Or you could say, and this is what I would say, this is evidence that confetti is perfectly,
That was the joke, yeah. That was the
right,
punchline.
does the job.
Yeah, confetti rings, okay.
So I mean, that's the sort of like, that's a sort of what I take as sort of the phenomenological, as I take that as a sort of a phenomenological move, in the sense that if I experience my dog as thinking, it doesn't matter what sort of physiological, and in that sense, scientific kind of evidence could be presented to me. If there was nothing in there, that would mean to me thinking requires nothing, right? You could have an empty head and think, because he was obviously thinking. Why? That's how I experienced them. Okay.
At the point where you use a phrase like noticing the as, would I be unfair to Heidegger if I started asking questions about the discovery and imposition of metaphor?
Give me a little more on that.
I'm asking, when you say noticing the as, do you think Heidegger was talking about discovery and imposition and/or imposition of metaphor?
Well, I think when he talks about discovering, I think it's probably simpler in the sense that I think he just means the difference between, say, when I'm drinking water, the difference between just being completely absorbed in the water drinking experience and being able to say, I'm now drinking water. So to experience the water as water is to be able to say, there's some water and here's what, and you wouldn't even have to be able to say, here's what I mean by water, but just the experience of, I'm experiencing it as some water and can reflect on it even as it's occurring. As opposed to the way that he sees animal captivation, he thinks of it as just being sort of assaulted by the water. And that's all, and that's completely all the experience is. And so when he talks about it as sort of being, sometimes, you know, the way that it gets translated is, he says the animal is sort of like benumbed by its world. It's this sort of pure absorption. And so when he talks about the as, I think an easy way to think about it, it's the way that we're capable of not only being sort of assaulted by objects and by the world, but be able to recognize the assault of objects as the assault by objects.
That sounds like a metaphor to me.
I'm not sure where the metaphor.
Yeah, an assault. The assault comes from a different realm of understanding than I naively expect my young children to understand as being part of the basic experience of reality. I think I'm bringing to them an analogy, a metaphor from warfare or from some other place where I found that word assault.
Okay, and another way to talk about it, Heidegger says submission. So you might say the animals, for him, is in a state of complete submission to its world. And we are also, I mean, we're in a state of submission in the sense that I can't decide, since I'm hungry, this will now be a sandwich, right? That I can't just, the world has its own integrity that I can do nothing about. And in that sense, I'm submitted to the world, right? And for Heidegger, that's the source of anything like affection, right? That I'm affected by the world refers to the fact that I don't have complete control over it. That the world does what it does, and I have to go along with it or suffer the consequences. Or in other words, that I suffer the world. Right? And he says that animals are in this, and then he tries to go back on it, but are in this state where it's a pure suffering of the world. And that's what I mean by being assaulted by the world. Right? And again, you could think of this as metaphorical, taken from some other aspect of existence or of experience. But I think that's part of the way that Heidegger sees human existence, as being in a position where the world is assaulting us, that we are that the world it imposes itself on us. And that's why, so I can't...
Strategic imbalance.
Yeah, and I think, and again, I think this goes back to sort of phenomenological method. This is the way Heidegger sees the world, right, as a source, at least to a certain extent, and to a strong, and this is why he sees this, where this idea, I think, of thrownness comes from in Heidegger, is that he sees the world as something that is a source of frustration and it's something that imposes itself on us. It's something that it's something that prevents us from getting things accomplished.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's like traffic jams, right?
I guess I have mostly just a historical question.
Mm-hmm.
And it concerns the kind of the language in the project here. And the way of describing animals, this notion of poverty or world impoverishment, to the how do we know questions, the idea of transposing this kind of phenomenological standard confetti business, awesome stuff. No, it's all good philosophy of mind today would say exactly the same thing. It just strikes me, though, that this entire way of talking that he's using here, and the kind of the project and thinking about deprivation, there's something going on, I think, right out around the same time, in fact, just a little bit earlier, in Germany. There's this crazy Estonian, name's Jakob von Uexküll. Yeah, and that's
Who he refers to and talks about
well, this
a
is
lot,
what I was
yeah.
wondering. Yeah, I was just
Yeah.
wanting to know, because this is Jakob von Uexküll's way of working, of thinking about the Umwelt, of being a kind of Kantian-driven biologist, and that gave you the phenomenological side, right? Because the aim was, well, let's approach it as Kantians and think, what does this critter, a dog, a chicken, a clam, need to survive?
And they've got their own little sphere.
And we can draw these wonderful little pictures of clam street scenes, right? No, this is Jakob von
Yeah, I can see
Uexküll's
that.
paces are. It starts with a street scene, just as a picture from a human perspective. Then redraws it from a dog's perspective, and then redraws it from a fly's perspective, and then ultimately a clam.
Yep.
Yeah, and of course it's not very exciting from a clam's perspective. Well, this was I was just wondering, because this whole
Now, if you're a clam.
it sounds
Yes.
very much like Jakob von Uexküll's way of working. And then for the folks that are worried about the science side, well, the fact is Jakob von Uexküll is going to be the great granddaddy of all modern cognitive ethology and behavioral ecology. There's the entire science today that concern animal minds comes out of Jakob von Uexküll's work. And it's precisely this notion of the Umwelt. So it's this phenomenological notion coupled with Kant, right? So Heidegger is using this?
Yeah,
Because it sounds like it. I just been guessing.
And he, in fact, he uses a lot of his he used a lot of his language. I never knew how to say it because I've only read it, you know. And
I
so
think you just have to say it really weird.
yeah.
We won't know
I don't really know how to
anyway,
say
Yeah.
Estonian names that's been thrown, right?
So, and he uses that whole language of disinhibition.
Yeah.
So he draws on him for a lot of this.
Okay, well, I was, as you were saying all this, because I was kind of wondering, is this independently coming out of Heidegger, and so there's just this something in the air, like
Yeah.
zeitgeist in Germany at this moment, or is it
Yeah.
people are tied into von Uexküll?
He's reading him. Yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one last question.
Staying on the idea of deprivation, does Heidegger give more examples beyond the stream of how remediation is ontologically possible?
Give me a little more on that. In the case of deprivation, that this
Yeah,
is the
in terms of being poor in the world poverty, deprivation. I'm curious about the idea of remediation and how that occurs.
Yeah. In the case of, so the idea would be that not all deprivations are irremediable, right? So in the case of the poor or meager flow of the stream, which is weird because it sounds like, oh, that must be, he refers to that when you talk about the difference in quantitative lack and deprivation. You think, oh, that's quantitative lack, which says, no, it's deprivation. But it actually could be either. So the idea would be that not withholding is a type of deprivation. Specifically, it's where you have the ought but not the can. Whereas you can have deprivations that have both, because he defines deprivation as it ought and can. So it's a little tricky. So the idea is that deprivations are lacks that ought to be and can be remedied. So like in the case of the stream, if it's a deprivation rather than quantitative lack if it's getting to the point where it's lost its stream character as a result. But that could be remedied because it could get refilled, right? So it rains enough and now it's a stream again. So the idea then is that deprivations in general are intrinsic deficiencies. And that's the important point for him, is it's a deficiency because it ought to be remedied. It's a deficiency that's intrinsic to the nature of the thing in question. Whereas if it's merely quantitative, it's not. It's comparative in the sense that it's only a deficiency when you're comparing it to other states of the thing. It's not as though a river that's running low but is still doing its river thing. There's no reason why there's no demand for it to get remedied. What's peculiar about the withholding is that it's a deprivation in the sense that remediation is demanded because of the nature of the thing, but it can't happen. And so there you might say, well, I thought deprivations have the ought and the can. Right? They ought to be and can be remedied. Well, this is something that ought to be but can't. Why are you calling it a deprivation? And that's why I think he gets into this idea, why he cashes it out in the idea of a potentiality. It's something that could happen, but it not really. And it in principle couldn't happen. So it's not as though it's like, 1,000-foot chair. Well, you could, but who's ever going to do it, right? It's something that is demanded, but could never come about. And I think part of the problem then is this breaks with the logic of deprivation in a certain sense. But this is something that's always happening in Heidegger, is when he talks about these sorts of phenomena, he's talking about things that break with really the whole logic of rational thought, that then requires some sort of recasting of the ontology of whatever he's talking about in these cases. And that's why I think, so that's, why in Heidegger, I think it's because of this idea of an ought without a can, or a pure potentiality, that his conception of Dasein requires that he rethink the whole ontological assumptions of the entire philosophical tradition, or he thinks that's where it pushes him. And that's what's happening again in this idea of animality.
All right, well, we've run out of time, but let's thank Professor Tanzer.